Agatha Harkness is one of the most fascinating lesbian characters in modern pop culture. Now, the funny thing is about Agatha is that she wasn't originally written as a lesbian or a queer coded character. You see, Agatha first appeared in Marvel Comics back in 1970, and when she did, she was an elderly witch that worked as a nanny. And that's not exactly the stuff of Sapphic Tumblr edits. But somehow, over the course of 50 or so years, Agatha has transformed from this mysterious old comic book witch into one of Marvel's most beloved lesbian characters. And here's where things get even more interesting. Because most people think the story begins with Ria Vidal, the kiss, the ex-girlfriend drama, and the chemistry between Kathryn Hahn and Aubrey Plaza. But that's not actually where Agatha's queer history starts. You see, long before there was Agatha All Along and Rio, and long before Marvel Cinematic Universe confirmed anything, lesbian audiences had already claimed Agatha as one of our own. And honestly, I think there's a reason for that, because Agatha belongs to a very specific category of fictional women, a category that lesbians have been observing for decades. Powerful, intimidating, morally questionable, usually better dressed than anyone else, and completely uninterested in making herself smaller for anybody. Today we're talking about Agatha Harkness, every version of her, and how she became a lesbian icon, and why queer women saw something in her long before Marvel did. So, if you've only encountered Agatha through Kathryn Hahn, you might be surprised to learn that comic Agatha was originally very different. When Agatha debuted in Fantastic Four number 94 in 1970, she wasn't a seductive witch. She wasn't sarcastic or scene stealing, and she certainly wasn't flirting with the personification of death. No, no, she was an old woman, literally, an elderly old lady witch hired to care for Franklin Richards. Honestly, that version of Agatha is interesting because she exists completely outside traditional expectations of womanhood. She's not defined by romance, motherhood, male approval. She's powerful because she's knowledgeable. Her age, her experience, while none of that automatically makes the character a queer character, it does place her outside of social, societal norms and roles that women are expected to occupy, because historically, women that exist outside those expectations have often become queer icons, whether the creators intended for that to happen or not. Agatha's no exception. Now, before we continue with Agatha herself, I think we need to talk about something bigger, and that is the witch. I genuinely don't think Agatha Harkness becomes a lesbian icon without first being a witch. The truth is, witches and queer people have been linked in popular culture for a very long time. And that's not because all witches are queer, and it's not because all queer people are witches, but it's because both groups have occupied similar spaces in society's imagination. If we think about the traditional image of a witch, that is usually a woman who lives outside the accepted social order, who cannot be controlled, and who possesses knowledge that most people would find uncomfortable. A woman that exists beyond boundaries of what is considered to be acceptable. Historically, accusations of witchcraft were often levelled at people who threatened the societal norms. They were people that were outspoken, independent, lived alone, and maybe rejected expected gender roles as well. And especially in women, they were those that made others uncomfortable by refusing to stay within the traditional box that society had planned for them to be in. And what's important is not to oversimplify history, because witch trials across the world were very complex and devastating. The events of these things affected many different kinds of people and not just women. Culturally, the figure of the witch evolved into something very specific, however, because the witch itself became a symbol of female rebellion, of female autonomy, and women who refused to conform. And if you think about it, that's a theme that resonates strongly with queer audiences, because the witch and the queer person occupy a very similar space in the cultural imagination. They're often portrayed as dangerous outsiders. They both challenge social expectations, and both have been historically accused of corrupting others by simply existing. And they've both been feared far more than they've actually deserved to be. And that's not fair, I know. And they've both become symbols of resistance in their own way. And that's one of the many reasons why witchcraft and queer culture have developed such a strong bond over the years, because both communities understand what it feels like to be different and to be told there's something wrong with you and to be the outsider, but then to still build a life anyway, despite all of that. And you can see the connection itself across popular culture. If you take the movie Practical Magic, on the surface, it's a story about two sisters from a family of witches. But underneath, it's actually a story about women that don't fit in, about women that are judged before people even know who they are, and yet they find strength through community. The Owens women are treated as outsiders simply because of who they are. And that feeling is incredibly familiar to many queer viewers. Then, if you look at the movie The Craft, the original movie, that film practically radiates outsider energy. Four teenage girls who feel isolated from the people around them. Four young women trying to find power in a world that constantly dismisses them. It's no surprise that queer audiences connect with that film so strongly. There's also Buffy the Vampire Slayer, particularly when we get to the character Willow, a character whose magical development eventually becomes intertwined with her own queer identity. For many viewers, Willow's journey wasn't just about magic, it was about discovering who she really was and discovering her community, finding acceptance not just within others but within herself. There's also the Charmed TV show, another series built around women whose power exists outside conventional expectations, and women who are constantly balancing a secret identity and belonging. Again and again, we see the themes emerge of difference, otherness, self discovery, power. It's just that the language used, it might change, the setting itself might change, the characters might change, but the theme is the same, it's consistent. And that's why I think that queer audiences are already primed to connect with the likes of Agatha before Marvel ever made her into a queer woman, because she already belonged to an archetype that many of us understand instinctively. She is a powerful witch, an outsider, a woman that refuses to conform and doesn't seek permission, and she exists on her own terms. Now, as a practicing witch myself, which you may or may not know, I think that's a part of why witchcraft continues to resonate with so many people. At its best, witchcraft asks you to know yourself. You question things. You don't assume. You examine beliefs. You decide what's meaningful to you rather than blindly following what others expect of you. And for many queer people, that process feels very familiar because coming out often involves asking the same kinds of questions. Who am I? What do I actually believe? And what parts of myself have I hidden? What would happen if I stopped trying to be the person everyone else expects me to be? So by the time Agatha Harkness arrived on our screens, she wasn't just a Marvel character, she was carrying with her centuries of symbolism, the symbolism of a witch, of an outsider, of a woman that refuses to fit into the world she's been given. And then Marvel cast Kathryn Hahn in that role, and everything changed. But up until this point, Agatha's relationship with the queer audiences had largely been theoretical. She was a witch, an outsider, and she fit into that archetype which many lesbians have historically gravitated towards. Then Marvel did something that completely changed the trajectory of the character, and they cast Kathryn Hahn to portray her in the cinematic universe. And honestly, I don't think Marvel had any idea what they were about to unleash with that, because Kathryn Hahn possesses a very specific and very dangerous power, a power that's been affecting lesbians for years. She can walk into any scene and change anything. Raise one eyebrow, and suddenly thousands of queer women are questioning every life choice they've ever made. And it's actually quite impressive. Now, when WandaVision first aired, Agatha wasn't supposed to be the main attraction. The show, of course, was about Wanda, and it was set in a sitcom format. It was supposed to be this mystery centered around Wanda's grief. And then Agatha was introduced as the nosy neighbour, the weird woman next door, the comic relief. She was supposed to be a supporting character. That's what Marvel thought, because what actually happened was that the audiences became obsessed with her. And I mean obsessed, because the second Kathryn Hahn appeared on screen, there was this immediate sense that she was operating on a completely different wavelength to everyone else. Every scene she entered became more interesting, more memorable, and then came this reveal that it was Agatha all along. And then that song went viral, and then the internet completely loses its shit. And suddenly Agatha Harkness is like everywhere. People are making edits, memes, writing fan fiction, buying merch for a character that she didn't even exist like 6 weeks earlier to most people. Somewhere within all of this, something very funny starts happening. The lesbians arrive. Not that we'd been invited, but we don't really wait for invitations. We just appeared like a coven, sensing a disturbance in the force. Now, to be clear, Agatha wasn't canonically queer in WandaVision, although there was a lot of subtext. However, nothing in the show explicitly tells us that Agatha is attracted to women, not really. Um, there's one thing, though, that queer audiences have developed after decades of consuming media. It is pattern recognition, and Agatha was setting off every alarm bell imaginable when it came to that. She belonged to a long and noble tradition of women that lesbians have been obsessing over for generations. Powerful women, difficult women, women who are smarter than everyone else around them, those that command every room that they enter, and women that are also vaguely a bit terrifying. Agatha could absolutely ruin your life and somehow make you say thank you for that. If you've watched my previous video, which was all about Miranda Priestley, you'll already know exactly what I'm talking about. I mentioned some examples in there. Obviously, Miranda, you've got Villanelle from Killing Eve. I mean, Kate Blanchett in like 99% of the roles that she, you know, does. The archetype is eternal, and Agatha fit right into that because she is sarcastic, manipulative, intelligent, confident, unapologetic. She doesn't care if you like her. She doesn't care if you think she's nice. She doesn't want to make you feel comfortable. And for many women, especially queer women, that's actually really appealing. And it's not because those traits themselves are queer, but it's because we've spent much of our lives being told to be the opposite. We are told we have to be agreeable, pleasant, accommodating, make ourselves smaller, and Agatha is anything but that. She takes up space and she enjoys it. She's a huge, huge character, and that's a huge part of her appeal. I do, however, think there's another reason that lesbians connected with Kathryn Hahn's Agatha so strongly. She's camp, and camp has always had a complicated relationship with queer culture. Agatha's not subtle, she's not restrained, she isn't interested in reason, and she isn't interested in realism. Everything about her is theatrical. Her dramatic entrances, her exaggerated facial expressions, her flamboyant delivery, the complete commitment to every ridiculous situation. She knows she's entertaining, and Kathryn Hahn knows exactly how to weaponize that. The result is a character who feels larger than life, a character who is constantly performing. And historically speaking, queer audiences tend to love characters who understand performance and understand reinvention. So, while Marvel may have introduced Agatha as a villain, many viewers actually saw something else. They saw a queer icon in the making, a woman who existed outside of convention, who wasn't interested in fitting in, and who was completely gloriously herself, whether society approved of that or not. And here's the really interesting part: this wasn't just happening inside a lesbian space. The broader fandom was becoming fascinated with Agatha too, and people wanted more of her, more stories, screen time, and chaos. Marvel had accidentally created one of the most popular characters in the entire MCU, which led to something nobody would have predicted when WandaVision first aired: that Agatha Harkness would get her own TV series. But before we get into Agatha All Along and the Sapphic ex wife drama that would eventually break the internet, we need to talk about a version of Agatha that most people completely missed. A version that quietly made Agatha queer before the MCU ever did. That version lives in a video game called Midnight Suns. So, here's a part that no one really talks about when it comes to Agatha. Genuinely, when I started researching this video, I was shocked by how many people seem completely unaware of this. Because if you ask most Marvel fans when Agatha Harkness became a lesbian character, they'll probably point you to Agatha All Along and her relationship with Rio Vidal. They'll point to Aubrey Plaza, they'll point to the kiss. And while all those things are important, they're not actually the first time Agatha was portrayed as a woman who loves other women. For that, we need to talk about a video game. A video game a lot of people either never played or completely forgot existed, and that's Marvel's Midnight Suns. So, if you've never heard of Midnight Suns, don't worry, you're not alone, because despite having a fantastic cast of characters, it's not exactly a mainstream Marvel game, which is a shame because inside this game is one of the most interesting versions of Agatha Harkness ever created. And more importantly for this discussion, one of the queerest. Now, when we meet Agatha in Midnight Sun, she's already dead, or at least mostly dead, because her spirit remains tied to the Abbey. a magical sanctuary that serves as the team's headquarters. And while that sounds incredibly dramatic, and trust me, it is, somehow it becomes even more dramatic from there. Because as the story unfolds, we learn about Agatha's relationship with another incredibly important character, Sarah, or Sarah, known as the caretaker. Now, the more we learn about them, the more obvious it becomes that this isn't a friendship. It's not just a mentorship, it's two women who loved each other very deeply and profoundly for many years. And the game presents Agatha and Sarah as partners who shared a life together and a home and built something together. And perhaps most importantly, they effectively raised the game's main character together, Hunter. Hunter is the player's character, and Hunter isn't simply connected to Agatha and Sarah through circumstance. The relationship feels familial, it's domestic and intimate because there's history there, there's life there. A sense that these two women created a home together long before the events of the game itself. And honestly, that's one of the things that I find the most fascinating about this version of Agatha. Because Midnight Suns doesn't make a big spectacle of it. It doesn't stop the story itself to announce that Agatha is queer. It doesn't treat the relationship like a shocking revelation. It just simply exists. Agatha loved Sarah and Sarah loved Agatha, and the game treats that as completely normal, which in many ways is exactly what good representation should do. Now, was Midnight Suns a cultural phenomenon? No, unfortunately it wasn't, because most people never played it. Most Marvel fans probably couldn't tell you a single thing about its plot. But I think it's precisely why Agatha's role in the game is so interesting, because it feels like a missing piece of the puzzle, a hidden chapter in Agatha's evolution. While the internet was busy creating Sapphic interpretations of Kathryn Hahn's version of the character, Midnight Suns quietly went ahead and made Agatha openly queer. No fan theories required or subtext necessary, just text. And looking back now, it's difficult not to see Midnight Suns as a bridge between two eras of the character. On the one side, you've got the comic book character, the one who isn't explicitly queer but possessed many traits of that queer audiences could gravitate towards. And then on the other side, you've got Agatha All Along, a series where Agatha's relationships with women become more central to her story. And then sitting right in the middle is Midnight Suns, the forgotten middle child, the adaptation that quietly made Agatha Sapphic before most audiences even realised it was happening, which is why I genuinely believe this game deserves far more credit than it gets. Because in many ways, Midnight Suns walked so Agatha All Along could run. It proved that Agatha could be written as a woman who loves women, and it showed her queerness didn't contradict the character itself. If anything, it enhanced her. It gave her emotional depth, vulnerability, and complexity. And perhaps most importantly, it felt completely natural, as though this had always been one possible version of Agatha. Marvel simply needed someone willing to explore it. And once that door had been opened, there was really no going back. Because the next time audiences would see Agatha Harkness on screen, Marvel wasn't interested in subtle implications. They weren't interested in hints anymore or ambiguity. This time they were bringing in the big guns. Aubrey Plaza. And honestly, at this point, we all know exactly where this was going. So now we arrive at Agatha All Along. Now, the second Marvel announced that Aubrey Plaza had been cast in this series, the lesbian community began conducting investigations that would make the FBI nervous. Because let's be real, you do not cast Kathryn Hahn and Aubrey Plaza opposite each other and expect people not to have questions. because that's simply not how the law of Sapphic physics works. No, the moment the casting was announced, people started speculating. Who was Aubrey playing? How important was her role? Would she be an ally or a villain? A rival? A love interest? And then the show actually aired. And within approximately 30 seconds of Aubrey Plaza appearing on screen, lesbians worldwide collectively sat upright. Because Rio Vidal did not arrive with friendship energy, and she did not arrive with colleague energy or former co worker energy. Oh no, she arrived with the energy of someone who had either dated Agatha, wanted to date Agatha, or had spent several centuries plotting revenge after a particularly messy breakup. And as the episodes progressed, that interpretation became harder and harder to ignore. The looks between them, the tension they had, the constant emotional intensity, the way they seemed incapable of having a normal conversation. Every interaction felt charged, like two people carrying years of unresolved history. And honestly, that was one of the most smartest things that Agatha All Along does, is that it doesn't present Agatha and Rio as a perfect romance, because perfect romances are often boring. Instead, it gives us something much more compelling, a relationship that is built on love, grief, resentment, longing, and betrayal. The kind of relationship where it's immediately obvious that these people matter to each other, even when they can barely stand to be in the same room, and especially when they can barely stand to be in the same room, because underneath all the sarcasm and hostility is something much more painful: loss. The deeper the series goes, the more we begin to understand that Agatha and Rio aren't simply former lovers. No, they're people carrying enormous emotional wounds, people who love each other very deeply, but have also hurt each other very deeply. They are people who are still trying to navigate the wreckage behind all of that. And that's what elevates the relationship beyond simple representation. Because queer audiences don't want just queer characters. We want complicated queer characters, messy queer characters, characters who feel like real human beings and are allowed to make mistakes, characters that are allowed to be selfish or destructive, romantic, irrational, flawed. For years, the LGBTQ representation often came with a visible condition or invisible condition. Queer characters had to be good, likable, safe, respectable. Agatha and Rio were none of these things, and thank goodness for that. They're dramatic, they're messy, manipulative, sometimes they're downright awful, and yet they're also deeply sympathetic. Because underneath all the magical chaos is something incredibly relatable: the pain of loving someone and losing them, and the pain of carrying unresolved feelings. It is the pain of wondering whether a relationship can ever truly recover from what happened between you. Perhaps that's why the relationship resonated so strongly, not because it's queer, but because it was allowed to be emotionally complicated. Queerness itself wasn't the story, the relationship was the story, and that distinction matters. Because for decades, queer audiences have been forced to search for scraps, for subtext, hints, characters who felt queer but could never actually say it. Relationships that stop short of confirmation. Moments designed to be interpreted rather than acknowledged. And that's not because they invented Sapphic representation, far from it, but because they represented a moment where Marvel finally stopped dancing around the possibility. Subtext just became text, implication became confirmation, and chemistry became canon. Perhaps the most satisfying thing about the entire situation is that it didn't feel forced. It didn't feel like a sudden reinvention of the character. It felt like a natural conclusion of a journey that had been unfolding for years. Comic book Agatha existed outside traditional expectations. WandaVision transformed her into a queer fandom icon. Midnight Suns quietly made her Sapphic, and then Agatha All Along brought that evolution into the spotlight. For the first time, Agatha wasn't simply a character that lesbians had adopted, she was a character whose queerness was part of her story, officially, openly, unapologetically. And that's why I think Agatha Harkness has become such an important character for so many people, because she represents something that queer audiences don't nearly get enough of. A powerful older woman, a complicated woman, a flawed woman, a witch, a survivor, a lover, a villain, a hero, a disaster, sometimes all of those things at once. Or to put it another way, she is toxic Yuri excellence. And we love her for it. So when people talk about Agatha Harkness becoming a lesbian character, I think they're asking the wrong question. Because the more interesting question isn't when Agatha became queer. It's why so many queer women recognise themselves in her long before Marvel officially confirmed anything. I think the answer lies in everything we've talked about throughout the video already. The witch, the outsider, the woman that exists beyond society's expectations, the woman who refuses to shrink to make herself feel, well, to make other people feel more comfortable. The woman who isn't interested in asking permission. No. For decades, queer audiences have developed a kind of cultural radar because we had to. Because for a very long time, mainstream media wasn't creating stories for us, at least not in the open. So we learned to read between the lines, and we learned to identify characters that felt different. The characters who lived on the margins, who existed outside the rules. Again and again, those characters became important to us, not because they were officially queer, but because they reflected parts of our own experience. Agatha Harkness is one of those characters, long before Agatha All Along or Midnight Suns or Marvel MCU decided to ever make her queer. There was already something familiar about her. She was someone that never quite fit in and existed on the edge of society rather than in the centre, a woman who chose her own path. Because when Agatha All Along finally confirmed what so many fans had suspected, it didn't really feel like a dramatic reinvention of her. It didn't feel like the character was suddenly changed. It just felt like a missing piece clicking into place. A character who had spent decades embodying themes that resonated with queer audiences was finally allowed to be openly queer herself. Honestly, there's something incredibly satisfying about that. Not because representation is about checking boxes, or because every witch needs to be a lesbian, it's because stories matter. Characters we connect with matter. The reflections of ourselves we find in fiction matter, especially when we've spent much of our lives searching for them. Agatha's story isn't really about Marvel, it's about recognition. It's about the way queer audiences find themselves in characters long before anyone gives them permission to. Before Agatha was canonically Sapphic, she was already ours. She was the outsider, the witch, and the woman who refused to fit in. And that's why her journey feels so satisfying. Agatha wasn't turned into a lesbian. Marvel just finally caught up with what many queer women had been seeing all along. A character whose most famous moment is revealing that she was secretly behind everything the whole time. That feels strangely appropriate, right? Because in the end, it really was Agatha all along. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, let me know your favourite version of Agatha in the comments below. Was it the comics, WandaVision, Midnight Suns, Or was it Agatha all along? Don't forget, like, subscribe, hit the bell. And if you want more deep dives into lesbian pop culture, queer media, witches, villains, complicated women, all that stuff, you know where to go. And yeah, until next time, take care.